Sometimes, the smallest kindness finds the biggest truth the next day. The wind howled down 8th Avenue, sharp and restless, slipping through coats and cutting through skin like it had something to prove, and Emily Carter pulled her thin jacket tighter as she stepped out of the diner, the neon sign flickering behind her like a tired heartbeat at the end of a long shift. 10 hours on her feet, one break, and a tip jar that barely covered gas for the week. But she didn't complain, she never did, because somewhere between pouring coffee and wiping tables, she had learned that dignity didn't come from what you had, it came from what you gave, and that night, she was about to give something she couldn't afford to lose. She noticed him just past the bus stop, half hidden in the shadows, a man sitting still, too still for someone in weather like this, his coat thin, his posture rigid, like he had forgotten how to move, and for a second, she hesitated, because in this city, hesitation could mean safety, but something about him felt different, not dangerous, just lost. And then she saw his hands, steady but pale, wrapped around nothing, no phone, no cup, just empty air, and she exhaled slowly before walking over, her sneakers crunching lightly against the pavement as the wind tugged at her hair. "I'm going to freeze out here," she said, her voice soft but firm, the kind of tone people used when they had nothing left to prove, and the man looked up, his eyes sharp, alert, not confused like most, just distant, like he was somewhere else entirely. And for a brief moment, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, something that didn't belong to strangers. She didn't ask his name, didn't ask what happened, because she knew better than to force stories out of people who weren't ready to tell them. Instead, she slipped off her jacket, the only warm thing she had, and placed it gently over his shoulders, ignoring the cold that rushed in instantly against her skin. "There's a diner right there," she nodded behind her. "Coffee's fresh, and the heat actually works." And he blinked, as if processing the offer took more effort than it should. "Why?" he asked. Quietly, his voice low, controlled, not weak, just careful, and Emily gave a small shrug, tucking her hands into her sleeves as the cold crept deeper. "Because you're cold," she replied simply, like it was the most obvious answer in the world, and that seemed to catch him off guard, not the words, but the lack of anything behind them, no expectation, no curiosity, just fact. Inside the diner, the hum of fluorescent lights and the soft clatter of dishes wrapped around them as Emily guided him to a booth by the window, the one spot where the heat vent actually worked, and she slid a chipped ceramic mug across the table, steam rising in slow curls. "It's on me," she added before he could reach for anything, and for the first time, his gaze dropped, not to the coffee, but to her hands, steady, practiced, but worn, like they had carried more than trays in their time. And then, just for a second, the cuff of his sleeve shifted, revealing a glimpse of polished steel, a watch that didn't belong in places like this, not even close. But Emily didn't react, didn't pause, didn't look twice. She just turned back toward the counter, grabbing a spare sandwich from the kitchen pass, because hunger didn't care about status, and neither did she. And as she set the plate down in front of him, the storm outside pressed harder against the glass, the city blurring into streaks of light and shadow, and for a moment, everything felt suspended, like time itself had decided to slow down just enough to watch what would happen next. Emily moved through the diner like she always did, quiet, precise, never wasting a step. But that night, there was a subtle shift in the air, something unspoken that lingered between the hum of the refrigerator and the soft scrape of plates against the counter, and she could feel it every time she glanced toward the booth by the window where the stranger sat, his posture now more relaxed, the warmth slowly returning to his hands as he wrapped them around the coffee mug, though his eyes remained distant, watching the storm as if it carried answers he had not yet decided to face. She refilled his cup without asking, the dark liquid steady as her hand, and he looked up again, studying her in a way that felt different from the usual customers who either ignored her or expected something from her. This was quieter, more deliberate, like he was trying to understand something that did not fit into his world. "You do this often?" he asked, his voice measured, and she tilted her head slightly, not defensive, just curious. "Serve coffee," she replied, a faint hint of a smile touching her lips, and for a brief second, something softened in his expression. Something almost like amusement. "Help strangers," he clarified, and Emily shrugged lightly, glancing toward the empty tables before returning her gaze to him. "I do what makes sense in the moment," she said, as if kindness required no philosophy, only action, and that answer seemed to settle somewhere deeper than he expected, because he did not respond right away. Instead, he reached for the sandwich, taking a slow bite as if grounding himself in something real, something simple, and for the first time since she had seen him outside, there was a shift in his shoulders, a quiet release of tension that did not need words. The clock above the register ticked past midnight, the diner thinning out until it was just the two of them, and the low murmur of a late-night radio station playing somewhere in the back. And Emily leaned against the counter for a moment, watching the reflection of the streetlights ripple across the window glass. "You should not stay out there tonight," she said. After a while, her voice calm, practical, not intrusive. "The storm is getting worse." And he followed her gaze, the wind now driving rain sideways against the glass, relentless and cold. "I have stayed in worse places," he replied. But there was no pride in it, only fact. And Emily studied him for a second longer, noticing the way he spoke, the way he held himself even now. Nothing about him matched the situation he was in, except the silence he carried, and she reached beneath the counter, pulling out a folded blanket they kept for emergencies, setting it beside him without ceremony. "You can take the booth until morning," she said, already turning back to rinse a glass before he could protest. And that stopped him more than anything else she had done, because it was not an offer. It was a decision made without asking for permission, without waiting for approval, just quiet certainty. He looked down at the blanket, then back at her, and something shifted again, deeper this time, like a realization forming slowly beneath the surface. "You trust people too easily," he said, almost as a warning, and Emily paused, the water running softly over her hands as she considered his words. Then, she turned slightly, meeting his gaze with a calm steadiness that did not waver. "No," she said gently. "I just choose not to assume the worst." And the simplicity of that answer lingered in the space between them, heavier than anything else that had been said that night. And for the first time, he looked away first, his fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the table, as if holding on to something he had nearly lost. Outside, the storm continued without mercy, but inside, something quieter was taking shape, something neither of them fully understood yet. And as Emily finished her shift, tying her apron slowly, she glanced once more toward the booth, where the stranger now sat wrapped in warmth, his eyes no longer searching the storm, but watching her instead, not as a waitress, not as a stranger, but as someone who had, without knowing, changed the direction of his night, and maybe something more. The storm had not softened by morning. It had simply grown quieter, like a warning that no longer needed to raise its voice. And the first gray light of dawn slipped through the diner window, casting a pale reflection across the empty tables, the kind of light that made everything feel honest, stripped of illusion. And Emily stood behind the counter, tying her hair back as the coffee machine hissed to life, the routine grounding her in a way nothing else could. But something felt different, not in the room, not in the air, but in the absence of something she had not realized she was noticing. She turned toward the booth by the window, expecting to see him there, wrapped in the thin blanket, watching the world like he did the night before, but the seat was empty, the blanket folded neatly, placed at the corner as if it had never been used, and for a moment, she simply stood still, her hand resting lightly on the counter, as if waiting for the rest of the scene to catch up. She walked over slowly, her steps quieter than usual, and that was when she saw it, not immediately obvious, not dramatic, just a small shift in the ordinary. The bill she had left on the table the night before, the one she had marked as unpaid without thinking twice, now neatly settled. And beneath it, folded with deliberate precision, was a stack of bills, more than the meal, more than the coffee, more than anything that made sense for what had been given. And Emily frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in quiet disbelief, because it was not the amount that caught her attention, it was the intention behind it, the way it had been left, without note, without signature, without any attempt to be seen. She picked it up, her fingers brushing against the paper, and that was when she noticed the second detail, something heavier, something colder, resting just beside it. The watch, the same polished steel she had glimpsed the night before, now sitting there in plain sight, catching the morning light with a quiet confidence that did not belong to a place like this. And for a brief second, she considered what it might be worth, not in dollars, but in meaning, because people did not leave things like this behind by accident. And yet, she did not rush, did not react the way most would. She simply turned the watch over once, studying its weight, its precision, then set it back down exactly where it had been, as if returning it to the story it belonged to. Behind her, the door chimed as the first early customer stepped in, shaking off the remnants of the storm, and the world resumed its pace. Orders called out, coffee poured, plates stacked, and Emily moved with it, seamlessly, quietly. But every so often, her eyes drifted back to that booth, to the space where a stranger had sat and said very little, yet somehow left something behind that felt larger than the money on the table. Hours passed, the storm fading into memory as the city stretched awake, and just before noon, the small television mounted in the corner flickered to life with the morning news, the volume low, barely noticeable, until a name cut through the noise, clear and sharp enough to stop movement itself. Daniel Hayes. The anchor said, the billionaire CEO who mysteriously disappeared last night. And Emily's hand paused mid-motion, the coffee pot hovering just above a cup, her eyes lifting slowly toward the screen, where a photograph appeared, polished, composed, a man in a tailored suit, standing beneath bright lights, a world away from the one she had seen just hours ago, and yet, unmistakably the same eyes, the same stillness, the same quiet distance, and for the first time since the night began, something shifted inside her, not shock, not fear, just a quiet understanding that the story she thought had ended at sunrise had only just begun. The diner did not stop moving, even when Emily did, because the world had a way of continuing whether someone understood it or not, and she slowly lowered the coffee pot back onto the counter, her eyes still fixed on the television as the anchor's voice carried on, calm and detached, speaking of stock prices, board meetings, and a sudden disappearance that had unsettled an entire financial district. But all Emily could see was the man from the night before, sitting quietly in her booth, holding a chipped mug like it mattered, and the contrast was almost unreal, like two different lives had overlapped for a moment and then separated again without explanation. Emily, you okay? Her coworker asked from across the counter, snapping her gently back into the present, and she blinked once, then nodded, her voice steady as always. Yeah, I am fine. Though her gaze drifted once more to the screen where his name still lingered. Heavier now, no longer just a stranger, but someone the entire city seemed to be searching for. She turned the television volume down without thinking, not out of disinterest, but because the noise felt unnecessary, and she reached for the watch again, the cool metal grounding her in something real, something she could hold, turning it slightly so the light caught the face just right, precise, flawless, untouched by the kind of life she knew. And yet it had been sitting on her table like it belonged there, like he had chosen to leave it behind, not by accident, but with intention. That thing real? Another voice chimed in, one of the early regulars leaning slightly over the counter, curiosity written plainly across his face, and Emily gave a small shrug, setting the watch back down carefully. Looks like it, she said simply, not offering more than that, because speculation did not interest her. Only what was in front of her did, and what was in front of her was a decision she had not yet made. Hours stretched forward. The morning rush came and went. The diner filled and emptied. Plates clattered. Orders were called. And through it all, the watch remained exactly where she had left it, untouched, unclaimed, as if waiting, and Emily worked around it, never moving it out of sight, never hiding it away, because something told her that hiding it would mean misunderstanding it, and she had no desire to do that. Just after noon, the sound outside shifted, not loud, not chaotic, but noticeable in the way people inside began to glance toward the windows, subtle at first, then more deliberate, like a ripple moving through still water, and Emily followed their gaze, her steps slowing as she moved closer to the glass. And that was when she saw it. Not one car, not two, but a line, dark, polished, stretching down the block with quiet precision, engines idling in perfect stillness, not drawing attention, yet impossible to ignore. The door chimed as it opened, But this time no one shook off rain or stamped their feet against the cold. Instead, a man in a tailored coat stepped inside, composed, measured, his eyes scanning the room not with curiosity, but with purpose, and behind him, another followed, then another, each one carrying the same quiet authority that did not need to be announced, and the entire diner seemed to hold its breath without realizing it. Emily did not move at first, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the counter, her expression unchanged, but her eyes steady, watching, waiting, because something inside her had already connected the pieces, already understood what the rest of the room was just beginning to feel. And as the first man approached the counter, stopping just short of the booth by the window, his voice low but clear, "We are looking for someone," he said, and before anyone else could respond, Emily spoke, calm, certain, not louder than necessary. "He sat right there," she said, nodding slightly toward the empty seat, and the man's gaze followed, then returned to her, sharper now, more focused, as if recalibrating everything he thought he understood about the room, about her, about the quiet waitress who had just become the center of something far bigger than herself. The room did not return to normal after that, even when the coffee kept pouring and the plates kept moving, because something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and Emily stood there, still and composed, as the man in the tailored coat studied her with a level of attention she was not used to receiving, not because she was invisible, but because she had learned how to move without needing to be seen, and yet now, every movement she made seemed to carry weight, measured and observed, in a silence that felt almost deliberate. "You spoke with him," the man said, not as a question, but as a conclusion already reached, and Emily nodded once, her expression calm. "He came in late," she replied, her voice even. "He was cold." And that seemed to pause something in the man's thinking, not the words themselves, but the simplicity of them, as if he had expected something more complicated, something layered with intention, and instead found only something direct, something honest. Behind him, the others remained near the entrance, their presence quiet but unmistakable, each one standing with the same controlled posture, as if they were used to environments where everything was managed, everything was known, and yet this place, this small diner on a side street, seemed to exist outside of that order, and for a moment, none of them spoke. "Did he leave anything?" the man asked next, his gaze shifting briefly toward the booth before returning to her, sharper now, more focused, and Emily did not answer right away, not because she was unsure, but because she chose her responses carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect for what had happened, and she reached beneath the counter, her movements unhurried, retrieving the watch and placing it gently on the surface between them, the polished metal catching the light once more, and the reaction was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but visible in the way the man's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his eyes narrowing just slightly as if confirming something important. He did not touch it at first, did not reach for it the way someone might reach for something valuable. Instead, he looked at Emily again, longer this time, as if recalculating something that had changed without warning. "He gave this to you?" he asked, and Emily shook her head softly. "No," she said, "he left it." And that distinction seemed to matter more than anything else, because the man's gaze softened, not in emotion, but in understanding, as if a missing piece had just settled into place. The diner remained quiet, the usual noise subdued beneath the weight of the moment, and one of the customers near the window leaned slightly forward, watching without meaning to, drawn in by something they could not quite name, while Emily stood exactly where she had been, her hands resting lightly against the counter, her posture unchanged, unaffected by the presence of wealth, of status, of attention, because none of that had been there the night before, and none of it had changed what she had done. "He will return," the man said finally, his voice lower now, more certain, and Emily met his gaze without hesitation. "Then I will give it back," she replied simply, and for the first time, something close to respect flickered across his expression, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it, without expectation, without hesitation, without the slightest hint of trying to hold on to something that did not belong to her, and that, more than anything else, shifted the balance in the room. Outside, the line of cars remained still, waiting, not for instructions, but for a moment. And inside, the small diner, with its worn booths and quiet warmth, held that moment with a kind of quiet strength that no one there had expected, least of all the people who had just walked in, because what they had found was not just a place, not just a witness, but a person who had already done something none of them could replicate, something that did not require permission and could not be bought. Time did not rush forward after that moment. It stretched, quiet and deliberate, as if the diner itself understood that something important was unfolding in a space too small for the weight it carried. And Emily returned to her routine, not because the moment had passed, but because she knew how to move through moments without being consumed by them, her hands steady as she refilled cups, her voice calm as she called out orders. Yet every sound in the room felt softer now, like it was careful not to interrupt what was still hanging in the air. The men near the entrance did not leave. They repositioned slightly, speaking in low tones that never rose above a murmur, their attention shifting between the door and the counter, waiting without appearing impatient, because whatever they were waiting for was not something they could control, and that alone set them apart from the world they came from. Emily noticed it in small ways. The way they did not check their phones every second. The way their eyes stayed alert, not distracted, as if they were measuring time differently here. And she understood without asking that they were not just looking for a man. They were waiting for a decision he had not yet made. "You should put that somewhere safe," one of the men said quietly, nodding toward the watch still resting on the counter. And Emily glanced at it briefly before looking back up, her expression unchanged. "It is safe," she replied, her tone simple, certain, and that answer seemed to settle something in him. Not because it was logical, but because it carried a kind of confidence that did not depend on circumstance. The hours moved forward, the lunch crowd thinned, and outside, the line of cars remained, a silent presence that drew occasional glances from passing pedestrians who slowed just enough to notice, then continued on, unsure of what they had just seen. While inside, the diner held its quiet rhythm, unchanged except for the awareness that something larger was pressing just beyond its walls. And then, without announcement, without build-up, the door opened again, the bell chiming once, clear and unremarkable, and for a moment, no one reacted, not immediately, because nothing about the sound suggested anything different. But Emily did, her hand pausing mid-motion as she set down a plate, her eyes lifting instinctively toward the entrance. And there he was, standing just inside the doorway, no longer hidden by shadows or weather, but unmistakably the same, his posture straight, his presence composed, yet carrying something new, something quieter, as if the night before had left its mark in a way no one else could see. The room shifted again, not loudly, but completely. Conversations softened, movements slowed, and the men near the entrance straightened almost in unison, their attention locking onto him with a precision that spoke of habit, of hierarchy, of a world that had just re-entered the room. And yet he did not acknowledge them right away, did not look in their direction, because his focus had already settled elsewhere. Emily did not move toward him, did not step forward or call out. She simply stood where she was, her hands resting lightly against the counter, her gaze steady, meeting his without hesitation, without curiosity, without expectation, just recognition. And, for a brief second, everything else fell away. The cars outside, the men in suits, the weight of whatever world he belonged to, leaving only the quiet space between them, the same space that had existed the night before when none of those things mattered. He took a few steps forward, slow, deliberate, each one measured not by urgency, but by intention, and when he reached the counter, his eyes dropped briefly to the watch, then lifted back to her, and there was something in that look, something deeper than gratitude, something closer to understanding, as if he had come back not just for what he left behind, but for something he had found and was not willing to lose. No one spoke first, not because they did not know what to say, but because whatever this moment was, it did not belong to words yet. And Daniel Hayes stood there, just a few feet from the counter, his presence no longer hidden behind exhaustion or cold. But it was not the polished version the world knew either. There was something quieter in the way he held himself, something less guarded, as if the distance between who he was and who he had been the night before had not fully closed. Emily reached for the watch. Without hesitation, her fingers brushing the smooth surface once before she lifted it and placed it gently between them, not sliding it across, not offering it like a transaction, simply returning it to where it belonged. And Daniel looked down at it for a moment, not immediately taking it, his gaze lingering as if the object carried more than time, more than value, as if it held the memory of something he had not expected to find. "You left this," Emily said, her voice calm, even the same tone she had used the night before, and Daniel let out a small breath, almost a quiet acknowledgement rather than a response. "I know," he replied, his voice steady, but softer than before, and that single exchange carried more weight than anything louder could have, because it was not about the watch, it was about the choice behind it. The men behind him shifted slightly, their posture attentive, waiting for instruction that did not come. Because Daniel did not look back at them, did not acknowledge their presence. His focus remained entirely on the woman in front of him, the one person in the room who had seen him without context, without title, without expectation. "You did not ask who I was," he said after a moment, his eyes lifting to meet hers again, and Emily gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "It did not matter," she replied, and there it was again. That simplicity that seemed to unsettle him in a way nothing else could, because in a world where everything was measured, evaluated, and leveraged, she had chosen not to measure at all. Daniel picked up the watch then, turning it once in his hand before fastening it back around his wrist, the motion precise, practiced, but slower than it needed to be, as if he was aware that this moment, like the night before, was not something he could rush through. "Most people would have kept it," one of the men near the entrance said quietly, unable to stop himself, and Emily glanced briefly in his direction before returning her gaze to Daniel. "It was not mine," she said simply, and that answer seemed to settle something in the room, not loudly, but completely, like a final piece falling into place. Daniel studied her for a long second, longer than necessary, as if trying to understand how something so small could feel so significant. And then he did something unexpected, not for the room, but for himself. He stepped back slightly, not away from her, but out of the space of transaction, out of the space where he could offer something in return and feel balanced again, because he understood now that balance was not what this was about. "Last night," he said slowly, choosing his words with care, "you did not treat me like I was worth something." And Emily's brow softened just slightly, not in offense, but in curiosity, and he continued, his voice quieter now, "You treated me like I was someone." And that distinction hung in the air, heavier than anything else that had been said, because it was not praise, it was recognition. And for a moment, Emily did not respond, not because she did not understand, but because she did not need to fill the silence. She simply met his gaze, steady, grounded, exactly as she had been from the beginning. And in that silence, something shifted again, not in the room, not in the people watching, but in Daniel himself. Because for the first time in a long time, he was not trying to control the outcome. He was simply standing in it. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling into something steady and undeniable, as if the entire room understood that whatever was happening between them was not meant to be interrupted. And Daniel remained where he stood, no longer the center of a system that moved at his command, but simply a man standing in front of someone who had seen him without any of it. And for a moment, he allowed that to exist without trying to shape it. Behind him, one of the men shifted forward slightly, clearing his throat in a quiet attempt to restore order. "Mr. Hayes, the board is waiting," he said, his voice controlled but carrying urgency beneath the surface, the kind that usually moved entire schedules, entire industries. But Daniel did not turn, did not respond, because for the first time, something else mattered more than the next meeting, the next decision, the next calculated move. Emily watched him carefully, not with curiosity, not with expectation, but with a calm awareness that had not changed since the night before, and she reached for a clean mug, pouring fresh coffee as if this moment required nothing more than what she had always done, placing it gently on the counter between them. "You should drink something warm," she said, her voice soft, grounded, and the simplicity of it cut through everything else in the room, through the tension, through the waiting, through the unspoken hierarchy that had just been set aside. Daniel looked at the cup, then back at her. And there was something almost unfamiliar in his expression, not confusion, not surprise, but something quieter, something closer to being understood without needing to explain, and he nodded once before taking the seat at the counter, not the booth this time, but closer, more present, as if he was choosing to stay in the moment rather than observe it from a distance. The men behind him exchanged brief glances, uncertain, not because they did not know what to do, but because they had never seen him choose not to act, not to lead, not to move forward when everything around him was waiting for direction. And yet here he was, sitting in a small diner, holding a cup of coffee like it was the only thing that mattered for the next few minutes. "They are not used to waiting," Emily said quietly, her eyes flicking briefly toward the group behind him before returning to her work, and Daniel let out a small breath, almost a quiet acknowledgement of a truth he knew too well. "Neither am I," he admitted, and there was no pride in it, only recognition, the kind that comes when someone finally sees something they have always overlooked. Outside, the cars remained, engines idling in perfect stillness, a line of expectation that stretched down the street. But inside, time had slowed again, bending slightly around a conversation that did not follow any script, and as Daniel took a sip of the coffee, his posture eased just slightly. Not enough for most to notice, but enough for Emily to see, because she noticed things like that, small shifts, quiet changes, the kind that revealed more than words ever could. "You can go," she said after a moment, not dismissing him, not urging him, simply stating what was obvious. And Daniel looked up at her, studying her expression, searching for something that was not there, no request, no expectation, no attempt to hold him in place. Just a simple acknowledgement that he belonged to a world that would not wait forever, and for the first time, that realization did not feel like a responsibility, it felt like a choice. He set the cup down carefully, not rushing, not lingering, just deliberate, and stood up slowly, his gaze meeting hers one more time. And there was something unspoken in that look, something that did not need to be defined, because it was already understood, and without another word, he turned, stepping back into the space he had left behind, the men immediately falling into place around him, the structure returning as quickly as it had disappeared. But as he reached the door, he paused for just a fraction of a second, his hand resting on the handle, and in that brief pause, something shifted once more, not in the room, not in the people watching, but in the direction of everything that would come next. The door did not slam when it closed behind him. It clicked softly, almost respectfully, as if even the sound understood that something had just shifted in a way no one could fully explain. And for a moment, the diner remained suspended in that quiet, the kind of silence that lingers not because there is nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be said had already passed between two people without words. Outside, the line of cars began to move, not all at once, but in a slow, controlled rhythm, engines turning, doors opening, the world reclaiming the man it had been waiting for, and within seconds, the street that had been filled with quiet expectation returned to its ordinary flow, as if nothing had happened at all. Inside, however, the air felt different, lighter in some ways, heavier in others, and Emily stood exactly where she had been, her hands resting against the counter, her posture unchanged, because for her, nothing had needed to change. She had done what she always did, nothing more, nothing less. One of the regulars let out a low breath, shaking his head slightly as he reached for his coffee. "You know who that was, right?" he asked, his voice carrying a mix of disbelief and curiosity. And Emily gave a small nod, not dramatic, not impressed, just acknowledging a fact that no longer felt as important as it might have an hour ago. "I saw the news," she said simply. And that was all. No excitement, no story, no attempt to hold on to the moment as something extraordinary. Because to her, it had not been about who he was, it had been about who he was in that moment, and that had not changed. The diner slowly returned to its rhythm, orders were called, plates were cleared, the hum of conversation rose again. But there was a subtle difference in the way people looked at her now, not loudly, not openly, just a quiet shift in perception, as if something they had overlooked before had suddenly come into focus. And Emily moved through it the same way she always had, steady, composed, unaffected by the attention, because she had never worked for it in the first place. Later that afternoon, As the sunlight broke through the last remnants of the storm, casting long, warm lines across the worn floor, a small envelope appeared on the counter. No one saw who left it. No one noticed when it arrived. It was simply there, placed neatly beside the register as if it had always belonged, and Emily picked it up without urgency, turning it once in her hands before opening it carefully. Inside, there was no check, no contract, no offer that could be measured in numbers. Only a single card, thick, understated, with a name she now recognized printed cleanly across the front, Daniel Hayes, and beneath it, written in simple, deliberate handwriting, a line that carried more weight than anything else that could have been offered. For the first time in a long time, I remembered who I was, and Emily read it once, then again, not because it was complicated, but because it was not, because it said exactly what it meant without needing to explain anything further. She closed the envelope slowly, placing it beneath the counter, not displaying it, not sharing it, just keeping it where it could remain part of her day without becoming the center of it. And as she reached for another coffee pot, moving seamlessly back into the rhythm of the diner, the world outside continued as it always would, busy, loud, driven by things that never stopped moving. But inside, something quieter remained, something that did not need recognition, did not need reward, because it had already done what it was meant to do. And in the end, nothing about Emily Carter had changed, not her job, not her routine, not the way she moved through her days, but somewhere beyond the walls of that small diner, in a world that measured everything in value and return, one man now carried something he had not had before, something no one had been able to give him, not power, not success, not control, but something far simpler and far more rare, the quiet understanding that sometimes being seen without being valued was what gave a person their true worth.